Welcome to the Culture Lab.
Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm Kyla Ronellenfitsch.
And I'm Gabe Roche. This week in the lab, the data's back. Results are in.
Data size.
Big.
Targeting.
Micro.
Under the microscope today, our loaded question. Did big data break the Democratic Party?
We dive into the data and speak with Democratic pollster Steven Claremont.
In this episode, we'll look into political myth versus reality. Has big data lived up to its promise, or has it all been a bit of smoke and mirrors?
Let's dig in.
Let us.
All right, Kyla, big news of the week. The Oscars. Did you watch Hollywood's Biggest Night?
No.
No.
No, as a hyper online person who is not necessarily like a movie junkie, I consume the Oscars like everyone else, which is waiting for the good moments to pop up on my social media and go from there.
All right. Well, okay. So surely you must have seen the hottest looks.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The red carpet.
That's the best part. One, I love Conan O'Brien, so saw some clips, and then the red carpet. I want to see the looks. I want to see the latest in cosmetic procedures. That is kind of more my cup of tea.
All right. Any favorite looks or cosmetic procedures?
Well, kind of both at the same time is
Amazing.
Anne Hathaway and Rose Byrne. I love them both. They're so funny. They're so great. Like physics defying facial situation that's happening. I don't know how they can have like full movement. This is a Botox reference. I don't know how they have full movement in their foreheads, kind of. But it's so smooth. I don't know. These are the things that you think of as, well, I don't know. Maybe you're thinking about these things as well, but I feel like you reach your mid-30s and suddenly you are bombarded with Botox talk.
Well, okay. So I was not so much paying attention to the Botox as I was to the fact that I did watch the ceremony, but on the subject of looks, like so many men wearing brooches.
Yes.
Was really interesting to me.
I like it.
And clearly Pedro Pascal has given his mustache to Leonardo DiCaprio.
I know. It is a trade down for him for sure. I feel like he did very well with the facial hair, but same with Leonardo DiCaprio looked great. So, what a pal he is.
Yeah. All right. So let's get to the meat of our discussion today. Did big data break the Democratic Party?
Yeah. Usually, we like to preempt our conversation with our guest with a bit of an overview of what the numbers show. But today we're actually going to give a bit more of a history lesson than a data dump. So let's start at the top. Gabe, what is big data?
Well, thank you for asking, Kyla. Big data is a term that evolved with the advances in the computing in advances in computing and digitization through like the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. It allowed people to analyze data sets that had previously been just way too large to analyze. And then with the internet, advances in storage in particular in like the 90s and the 2000s, the problem kind of reversed. Now we had server farms like full of data, and there had to be a kind of methodological catch up. But look, this is a show about our political culture, so I think we should look specifically at what is political big data. Okay, here's my sort of take on it. Mm-hmm. I think of big data, especially in a political context, as kind of integrating many, many data points. That's ingredient one, ingredient two, from a wide variety of sources, not just political ones. And kind of ingredient three or outcome is to be able to make predictions. So those are kind of the three ingredients.
What a tasty recipe.
Yes, but there's a lot going on under the hood. This is not a Rachel Ray 30-minute meal. And now I get to do my Rachel Ray impression.
Oh, no.
Is everybody ready?
Holding my breath.
Oh! Big data. Yamo.
I think it
Rachel
could
Ray
use.
as a Muppet.
I think it could use some work, to be honest. I don't know, but I
getting
liked
the,
it as a character. So
getting the 4 packs a day cigarettes in the voice. Anyway, okay. The ingredients. You want millions of data points. You want them linked to individual voters. Number 2, the data points are coming from many, many different sources. The most available data on voters, particularly in the US, is the US voter file. This will often tell you someone's party registration and crucially their historical turnout in past elections. This is different from what is released to Canadian parties. Parties, of course, will track contacts with each of these voters, and Kyla's going to say more about that in a minute. But especially in the US, you can also buy data from many different other sources, especially consumer data, really rich consumer data. The famous data source here, and not to beat a dead horse, that's also kind of an anachronistic horse, is magazine subscriptions.
yes, the number of times that I still have conversations about the magic of the magazine subscription when who's buying magazines anymore? They don't even mostly exist. But anyways, the lore continues.
I subscribe to the New Yorker, obviously.
Yes.
Because I'm so highbrow. But look, broadly, we can think of other consumer data as media viewing habits, podcasts you're likely to subscribe to, Culture Lab obviously at the top of that list, whether you own a gun, if you have a loyalty card from particular stores, you track purchase behavior, those kind of customer lists, that all gets sold and added to the kind of third ingredient, generate predictive models of things like vote choice, issue positions, and turnout.
Yeah, and this looks quite a bit different for the Canadian context. When I used to teach a class on political data management at Carleton, I used to start my first lecture with this kind of meme that had a yacht kind of in the Mediterranean as captioned as the expectation, and then a picture of a clothes iron held over the horizon of the same body of water as kind of the reality, not to diminish all of the incredible and advanced work that my colleagues in the political data space do in Canada, but because of resources and just the availability of data, we're looking at two very, very different things. In the last presidential, the Harris campaign burned through $1.5 billion in 15 weeks. I assume $1 or $2 of that was spent on data operations. And that's just, slightly different from the $30 million spending cap for our political parties. So we're really looking at different things. Right. But beyond that, a lot of it is structural. You talked about this a little bit, but US campaigns have access to their voter file, which alongside the other data sources that you talked about, means that they have hundreds, if not thousands, of data points on each individual voter. In Canada, political parties receive the list of electors from their election regulator, whether that's Elections Canada or the provincial entity. But the data is a lot more minimal. We don't register by political parties, so you aren't able to see, is someone registered as a liberal? That doesn't exist. Or as a conservative or as a New Democrat. You also don't get that record of, do they usually vote in municipal races? Do they usually vote in, are they a member of a specific political party? We don't have all of that kind of information that is on our list of electors. So that means that political parties are really, they have to rely on themselves to have the kind of data that allows for, the sophisticated sort of micro-targeting or outreach that we've been talking about. So doing things like door knocking, phone banking, even political polling kind of plays a role in this as well. But because we have less data on individual people, the ability to do predictive modeling, to be able to target someone off of, their niche interest is a lot more limited than would it exist in the US.
Right. So thinking about how big data may have broken the Democrats, the period when big data was truly popping off, in the business world, was also the period with the most prominent big data elections. And it's when the Democratic Party started on this trajectory of being such an analytics-focused party.
Yeah, well, analytics focused to me is sort of an understatement as someone who kind of follows these stories, or as we both do. It became part of sort of the identity of the Democratic Party, like the idea of a campaign being data driven is essential. It sort of became like the data scientists, or the data became sort of like the trump card of all of the different conversations around policy or communications that you could be having. It's like data is very much viewed as key.
All right, so let's trace this. We started to see it in Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. They built this tool called mybarackobama.com, or MyBO, which is, for a tool built by data engineers in a windowless room. I wonder why it's called MyBO.
The slander.
But it closely tracked supporters, like campaign engagement, and all of it could be added to the voter file that we were talking about earlier. Their big watershed moment was the 2012 Obama campaign. They had a chief analytics officer, real position, operated out of a windowless room called The Cave. They ran 66,000 simulations every night to produce daily win probabilities for each state. They could allocate funding, they could reallocate field staff, they could make decisions about tour. They were A/B testing. They had found that a fundraising poll would have especially strong effects among West Coast women in their 40s when they included an ask by George Clooney. So George Clooney's Ask.
I get it.
Ask with a K. Had a real strong pull. And they would do things like ask supporters to share their list of Facebook friends, and they told people which specific friends to reach out to. They didn't have their cell phone number, but these are people who are hard to reach voters, and that resulted in like 5 million additional voter contacts. Even the Republicans got in on the action. We all heard about Cambridge Analytica. It's kind of an overblown scandal. The actual use of like psychographic profiles didn't really materialize. But my favorite example from the Republicans is Ted Cruz's 2016 campaign in the Iowa primary against Donald Trump, where a canvasser told the Texas Tribune that when he arrived at the door of Bertie Harms, a 64-year-old grandmother in Des Moines, his canvassing app told him that Bertie was a, quote, this is her sort of profile from Big Data, a, quote, stoic traditionalist, is her typology, and that he should talk to her in a tone that was, quote, confident and warm and straight to the point. He should ask her whether she had concerns about immigration and guns.
I don't know why you are using that tone of voice. I also identify as a stoic traditionalist.
So I don't know if the model would predict that based on demographic profiles, but all right. Good to know. I'll add it to my data set. But so taken together, big data could be used for resource allocation, targeting advertising spend, candidate time, volunteers, fundraising, A/B testing, communication styles, and messaging, pretty much everything. And so I can see the temptation. Big data came to be seen as a kind of panacea, and certainly pitched as such by the analytics industrial complex that emerged out of these campaigns. And it's had profound cultural effects on people who run campaigns, especially among the big data leaders, the Democrats.
Yeah, and the topic of the episode is what are all the great things that big data has done. I think we've listed out a bunch of those, but sure. Where is there kind of a tension? And where I see two areas that are kind of cropping up of areas of criticism of the Democratic Party is around audience definition and message testing. In order to do the kind of resource allocation that you had talked about, Gabe, you need to know who you're talking to. Campaigns have always used or long used data to identify their voter universe. But when you're doing this through polling, it's kind of done through broad strokes. So, we're focused on young women with a university degree, for example. But big data changed this by allowing campaigns to target messages to the individual voter. So it's no longer, all young women with a university degree. You're instead thinking of Sarah from Indiana, who happens to have a university degree. That's a very different kind of use of resources and use of data. But more than that, campaigns use predictive models to take what we learn in the polling data. For example, a survey finding might be that people who support abortion access are overwhelmingly likely to vote Democratic. And we're able to predict to the individual. Who do we think cares about this issue and is therefore likely to be kind of motivated by it? And this creates I often hear people argue this can create a different strategic imperative for campaigns. It instead ends up being, when it's so easy to kind of find people and find your audience, it becomes more so about turning people out than it is about persuading them. And that means a very different experience of the campaign. It also means if you don't have data on that person, it's kind of like they don't exist in your campaign. You are just not deploying communications to them in the same way. And then the second area of tension is around message testing, the process of figuring out what to say and how to say it to voters. As Democrats continue to lose nationally, nothing will bring out criticism more, quite like losing. But there's been a lot of backlash from campaign organizers, from activists, from just, hyper engaged people online who think that the party is over reliant on data to inform messaging or just not really interpreting the data correctly. Last summer, there was sort of this mini scandal, mini battle over a memo based on results from more than 700 message tests conducted that David Shore, who's sort of like a famous Democratic data scientist, sort of like this data guru. Yeah, there's like New York Times profiles written about him. But he had advised Democrats not to talk about Trump's deployment of the National Guard in D.C. and instead to talk about the economy. So basically advised a pivot. I have a clip from fellow podcaster John Favreau from Pod Save America talking about this.
I could see why when you read someone two statements that are mostly about tariffs and Medicaid cuts, they're like, oh yeah, that's pretty fucked up. In real life, if someone was like, what's the deal with Trump's takeover of D.C.? And you said, it's a distraction from the tariffs, you sound like a fucking moron. And the person would think you sound like a fucking moron.
It's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of pivots. You know what I mean? That's all anyone's saying. Trump is talking about this because he doesn't want you to talk about that. And you can just insert anything you want.
His comments are in response to someone who built the 2012 Obama campaign models that Gabe had talked about earlier. I don't want to say this is a war, that would be kind of overblown, but it's criticism of someone who in other time periods, his brilliance, his expertise would kind of make him unimpeachable or the type of person like him, these kind of data gurus who everyone just took it at face value that their brilliance was worth paying attention to above all else.
All right. So that is the big data landscape and a nice articulation of the tension. Kyla, do you think our lab rats are feeling information overloaded?
Our lab rats? Never. There's no such thing as too much information about political data. But if it's helpful, we're now including the data and sources that we referenced in the show notes. So you can find it there for all of your, leisure reading.
Yes, definitely check those out. And look, we're just warming up because we're really excited to dig into how campaigns are using data today and whether this intense reliance on data has made politicians sound too much like soulless, fully optimized robots. No offense to our AI listeners.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with Steven, who I worked with for a few years at Change Research. I would say sometimes there's like a little bit of an old fogey problem in the polling industry where, I don't know, I find people can just dislike methodological change for sort of the sake of it. There's like a sort of methodological purity that happens. Steven is not one of those people. Change Research is one of the, I won't say rare, but one of the kind of few really successful disruptors in the political polling world. They also sell a lot of predictive models that we've been talking about. They have AI tools that they make available for campaigns. So they, it's not exactly like he's like, or that I expect him to be an advocate of just the way that we've always done it. I think it'll be a good sort of balanced conversation around the pros of cons. But yeah, let's get to it. I'm really excited.
All right, we are thrilled to have Steven Claremont's help in answering our loaded question. Did big data break the Democratic Party?
Steven Claremont is the head of polling at Change Research, a Democratic polling and data firm. He has advised political campaigns for over 2 decades, particularly helping to flip the House in New Mexico in 2016 and in pioneering messaging about freedom for Future Majority, a Democratic strategic firm. As a former colleague of Steven's, I can tell you there are 2 essential things to know about him. One, at any moment in time, he's ready to start ranting about Bush v. Gore and its lasting impact on American politics. And 2, he is the world's biggest Arkells fan. And in fact, his Spotify genre, his top genre on Spotify a couple of years ago was Canadiana, which I didn't even know was a genre, but it made me feel very inadequate as the one Canadian working at Change Research at the time. So welcome to Steven, our honorary Canadian. We're really happy to have you in the Culture Lab.
Well, yeah, thank you, Kyla. Thank you, Gabe. I really enjoyed the podcast so far, and I think beaches are about to be up there with Arkells in terms of my listening. So it's like trying to broaden out my Canadiana content that I'm consuming. So it's not just all Arkells.
It's some significant cred, including he went to a music festival in New Brunswick specifically to watch the Arkells, which is just, that is commitment.
Definitely. No, and they are fortunately coming to Washington, D.C. in a month, so I don't have to travel nearly as far.
Perfect.
Well, we're gonna have to put all these references and playlists in the show notes. I love it. So, Steven, we started off the show by kind of giving an overview of the rise of big data, especially through the Obama campaigns. Big data was definitely a buzzword, less of a buzzword today, but sophistication in data operations has only really gotten better. In your view, what are some of the most important strengths? I'm going to start with strengths. We'll talk about weaknesses after, but what are some of the strengths that really good quality data has given the Democratic Party?
I think it's given the Democratic Party and also gives groups that work in progressive politics. I mean, the point of big data really is to make campaigns run more efficiently. And if you have limited resources, what's the best way to deploy them to get in front of voters that you most need to, particularly in like lower turnout, smaller elections? Given, like, as Kyla said, that I rant about Bush v. Gore at a drop of a hat, was been working in this field as this was just beginning to take off in 2006, 2007, 2008. And one of the more useful things was there was some state legislative primaries I worked on in 2008 where we were trying to take out very conservative incumbents and was using the voter file and using big data to identify who hasn't voted in one of these before, who we could say is fairly certain is more progressive on issue positions. And if you can find 200, 300, 400 of those, you can win seats. I think it's become a little more challenging when we're thinking of much bigger elections with much bigger budgets. But if you sort of look at the point of like, how can we use data so I can maximize the number of votes I can get for the least amount of money? That's its true value. There's also like some quirks in the tax code where if you're a progressive organization, you can take money from nonprofit foundations and you can't use that to sort of help elect a Democrat or help elect a Republican. But if you use big data correctly, you can identify the voters who agree with you on an issue position and use that money to target them to bring them out while staying sort of on the legal line of the tax code and what you can spend money on. I think that's been sort of its value. I think the challenges has come from like, how do you balance narrative storytelling and the way that people's brains work and the way they process information from sort of very focused on numbers and analytics and messages with percentages. I think that's been the inherent tension since the rise of big data 2 decades ago.
So just thinking about that tension a little bit more, having this sort of data available to campaigners, what has that sort of led them to kind of deprioritize when they're they're putting so many resources into analytics?
I think the challenge is, and you can see this when I used to do a lot more volunteering for Democratic campaigns, and it was made me realize one of the big challenges was, okay, you can get really specific, and I want to talk to these voters, but then you're making a conscious decision to not talk to even more voters. And there was once I was given this packet, and it was like a townhome community nearby where I lived, and there were like 50, 60 townhomes, and they only wanted me to talk to 4 people there. And when you're like,
Right.
Still, it's like you can have big data, you can have a prediction of what someone's behavior is, but you don't know. It's not 100%. And it's just like, okay, it's 85% I can talk to a Democrat who might vote in this election, but I'm not talking to this person who we say is 65, but actually might be more likely to vote if given this prodding. You can get so efficient, but you end up talking to fewer and fewer people and have less and less to say. And that's sort of the problem of, and communications changes, the way people think politically change in the United States. We're, contrary to the way a lot of politics in America is covered, that we're polarized and you can't change anything, and it's very viewed as very static. It's not. It's dynamic. You can sort of see the way that we swing. I mean, especially as Canadians, you can see how schizophrenic we really are as we change from one wildly different government to another. That we are dynamic, and the more you think you know how everyone thinks, and it's based on 3, 4, 5-year-old data, it's just not useful anymore. And eventually, you just have to okay, how do we do mass communications again and have a few very important conversations, and not 30 different conversations about different topics where we don't have an overall narrative theme.
So what I guess, kind of hearing is that we're sort of optimizing for, I guess, mobilization of very specific groups, very targeted groups, and deprioritizing the mass communication, which is kind of what we would think about would be necessary for persuasion, right?
Yeah.
For bringing people over to your side rather than just kind of mobilizing people. Does big data give you any insight into kind of how persuasion could occur on more of a mass scale, or has it really boxed people who focus so much on analytics derived from big data into a mobilization frame?
That's a really good question, and I feel like it has, and it's again, I was not I've worked with Future Majority and some other nonprofits and for donors, but not with particularly in the last presidential election. One of the bigger ones is Future Forward, which is a very analytics based. It's funded by prominent people in Silicon Valley, and they have proprietary models where you show a bunch of ads and will say how effective they think an ad is. And they spent $1 billion, and Kamala Harris did not get elected. So I think inherently you would say that, okay, that's not really successful. And one of their big insights that they've repeated a lot is that there was no negative message against Donald Trump that their algorithm said that, okay, this will be effective and this will move votes. And I don't quite understand, and maybe it's just my old way of thinking, old man thinking of just you would think the third time Donald Trump is nominee, he's been indicted 34 times, there's led a coup on the United States, that there might be one message or one negative ad that would drive down his approval rating. And we have change research. We have millions and millions of questions that respondents that answer this question: rate Donald Trump on a scale from 1 to 10. And from the end of the 2022 midterms straight through to election day, if you look at everyone but strong Democrats, it's a slow line upward. And I just you can have all the big data you want. I really have a hard time thinking that there's not one thing you could have gotten to that might persuade someone on the fence that maybe electing Donald Trump's not a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is sort of I would say the big area of contention. Like, I think that there is specifically around message testing. How do we figure out what to say? And I think a lot of, we had talked about before for the first part of the podcast, talking about a lot of the frustration that exists, some of the backlash that exists with people that have kind of the exact same perspective that you just laid out, which is like, how is this possible that that the data always comes back to, well, you must pivot, or there never seems to be an advice of taking Donald Trump kind of head on. So I'm curious, in your experience with the Democratic Party, obviously you do an enormous amount of research with Change Research. You also see your colleagues in the space. When it comes to message testing, is the Democratic Party experiencing a methodological problem, or is it an interpretation problem?
I think it's a little bit of both. And I think there are definitely technologies that will help us get out of this. The challenge has always been in like traditional phone polling. You'll have like 10, 11 statements, and the interviewer will go through and ask each one of them individually how persuasive you find this. And it would always be, I think it's always been frustrating for ad makers, for people involved in the campaign when the pollster comes back and you can sort of see, well, there's only really a 10-point difference between any one of these messages. And then you have like multiple ideas together. How do you separate these? And I think there's been more effort to, like, I see these memos come by of like 30 different statements people tested or quotes, and like respondents will see online like 4 of them, and they have to say what's like the most persuasive and least persuasive. And I think anything that like makes it hard of a respondent to sort of look at these and differentiate them, you're still getting the problem of, is what you're reading to me ultimately going to be effective? And particularly when you're not really showing what the video is or doing an emotional content. And you can see that in a lot of these memos. It gets like, the stuff that always comes to the top is some variation of, Donald Trump said that he would lower prices, but now he's bombing Iran, or now ICE is shooting people in the street. And it always goes to these resource allocation questions of just like, he's cutting Medicare and Medicaid, and now he's bombing Iran. And it's all very intellectual, and it's not measuring people's emotions or emotional reactions. And you're sort of like looking at like the way Donald Trump ran his campaigns was, they did do a lot of big data also, but it was different. Like they would have a narrative structure and a narrative storytelling. Make America great again. You look at Trump's rallies, all he basically does is tell hero narrative stories where he's the hero of every story and he's fighting villains. And then the campaign would do also this A/B testing of different concepts and different ads. And they would see like which people, what are people engaging with the most? What are they clicking the most? What are they sharing the most? Which is something Democrats do as well. But they're very in tune of like, how do we get our base and our voters as riled and emotional as possible? And my hope is, and I've been experimenting on this week, is asked a bunch of open-ended questions of why you oppose the war in Iran. And I think if we can use analytical tools now through Claude or OpenAI, if you try to use that, is to look through like, what are people saying that they're reacting to emotionally, and build messages from that. There was John Della Volpe at Harvard just posted a piece recently from a new company he's associated with, which is doing AI. People are talking to sort of an AI voice, but it was with young men. And then what they're finding is that young men are responding very negatively to the Iran war because they feel personal fear for their safety about being drafted.
Yep.
And we're developing messages, whatever we're doing, we're developing messages that just talk about very bland intellectual resource allocations, and not like, how are people emotionally responding to what's happening in the country, in the world, and their lives. And as a Democratic Party, constructing messages to actually deal with their reality. And build stories from that. Like, I think the successful candidate in 2028 will be having not so much their own version of Make America Great Again, but sort of have a narrative, and then everything will fill and reinforce that narrative about how they'll lead the country, that I think will be more effective. I mean, that's why Barack Obama won in 2008. He was the right candidate with the right message at the time. And donors and political professionals became in awe of all the new things that he did. But the reality was, when he was president, the Democrats lost 15 Senate seats, like 63 House seats, tons of governorships, 1,000 state legislative seats. It didn't actually translate into sort of this progressive Democratic future that everyone was thinking could happen in 2009.
I think when you are talking about the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats, to me, you're almost laying out two different entry points to when they are using the data. And I wonder if, I mean, there's always a risk of like over learning from your competitors. And I think that there's part of, you know, the idea that every tactic that Donald Trump does is genius is, I think at this point, is kind of ludicrous. Like, I think he is Donald Trump, and then they figure out what to do with that. But I do wonder if maybe there is kind of a lesson learned in that, right? Like the Democrats, I think, spend so much time, and I would say, you know, parties on the left. This is maybe like the general broadly applicable way of doing message testing, which is like upfront. So you figure out, what am I going to say? What are the exact words that I'm going to use? And then I go and use them. And then you figure out also through the data, how do I disseminate that? And I think what you're laying out is they start with, what does Donald Trump believe and what can he speak about passionately? And then how do we disseminate it? And that is like the part of the process. It's kind of halfway through where they're really using the data as opposed to steer him in the direction. And I think about this a lot as a pollster, where I think, are we spending too much time thinking on like the right exact words? Like, do we need fewer message tests, and do we need more, like, I don't know, acting coaches of teaching people how to actually like say things in a way that you would want to actually persuade someone? Maybe. I don't know if that resonates with you at all. Also, you know, we are researchers. We do research, but I think you sometimes share my, I don't know, self-loathing or something you know, just really interrogating the kind of work that we do and really trying to come at it with like, are we measuring what we need to measure? Anyways, does that resonate with you at all? Is there some validity to that, of where we are using research in the process of figuring out what to say?
I would definitely agree with that. And I think when you sort of look at the sort of successful presidential candidates, or the most successful presidents through history, like Abraham Lincoln didn't do any polling about whether the Civil War was popular or not. FDR was just like, okay, how am I measuring? Do I have enough focus groups with people about how I should name these various programs? Or it's just like being a leader, being able to persuasively communicate, and having that sort of charisma and focus and understanding human beings, I think is vastly more important. And like maybe a little bit less like political science and more psychology and sort of cognitive thinking, which is how is what I'm going to do resonate with people. So I think it's definitely acting coaches. It's listening. It's not so much what you're going to say. It's listening to the voter, understanding what it is that they want, and how do you fit that in with the candidate's strengths. And I think a lot of that is, particularly going forward, leadership. And that's what leadership traits are we actually going to need going forward. And if it's like, we'll read any more about like, well, the Democrats are too left and they're too liberal and should go liberal and center, it's just like, it's like banging my head against the wall, because voters care about their own lives, and what they want is a leader. So like us as practitioners, our goal is to help the people we identify as leaders that will have the talent to do something, how they can communicate more effectively. But they're going to know like 95% of that. It's just like, we're just sort of tweaking the last parts of it. And I think this all like, usually sort of thinking is just like, candidates are just blank slates. They have no ideas. They stick their finger in and look to a poll on what to say. I've encountered very few people like that. But like our goal is just to help them get to that last part and sort of stay within sort of the guardrails of common sense more than you have to change if you have to change everything that you think and the way that you approach in order to win, you're probably not going to win.
Do we have the right tools to do that? I mean, we've talking about big data and all these, the big data tools that have been developed in infrastructure. We have the tools to do that. Do we have the tools to address what you and Kyla have been talking about?
I mean, I think so. I think it's just like, what are the new tools that are out there? And like technology doesn't stay static either. So like being able to use commercial voter files to give someone a score on an issue or something, that's been done for a while. But I think like the next is just like, how do you measure emotion? And like the history of like public opinion research is like, when we were only had the ability to talk, like for one person to talk to someone on the phone or like get 8 people into a focus group, and then hopefully someone will say interesting things and be vulnerable in front of other people. We were very limited in what the tools were. So it's just, as technology is changing, the question is just like, oh my God, it's like, we're going to use AI polling, or how's AI going to impact research? It's just like, okay, here are the tools that are there. How do we think these can work and make us better? But to use more tools and adapt and realize, okay, this was the limitation of phone polling, or this is the limitation of online polling. What new things are out there to give us more information to help us like be insightful when we're on meetings with other consultants and candidates?
Yeah.
So I think like the tools are there, but there's going to be more tools, and we can't sort of think, okay, I know all the tools, that's what's there, nothing's going to change. We've got to be adapting. We've got to be constantly adapting.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, like I think the emotional nature, like that is the fuel, right, of effective political communications. Is, I mean, ideally with some rationality in that, but it is, so much of it is emotion, identity kind of driven. And when you were laying out earlier, the Trump campaign really paying attention to the metrics, like what is kind of breaking through. But I think what we also know about the social media algorithms is that they really perpetuate anger, fear, more of that. Not all emotions, right? Like, not things that make you feel hopeful are not the most likely thing to be shared. It might be the thing that makes you most likely to vote. But anyways, so that is, I guess, that'll be your next technological innovation, is figuring out how to test research or test messages allowing for the full spectrum of human emotion, because I think we often downplay some of the different feelings that people have in campaigns.
Definitely, it is something that's like become more aware of, certainly within the last couple of years.
Cool. Well, I wanted to ask, I guess, a little bit about the culture, maybe, of how researchers, especially in the Democratic Party, are approaching these kinds of questions. I was kind of getting at it with my question about tools, and you spend all this time, lots of very smart people with analytics backgrounds kind of developing these tools, and they built a hammer and things look like a nail and they want to use it, using their sort of elite tools. Is this a reflection maybe of the sort of a culture shift in the Democratic Party toward kind of dominance of like elite rationalists, rather than, people with maybe more of a connection to normal people, to
Yes.
real people? How much of this is like part of that out of touch story that Democrats get labeled with so often?
It's a big part of it. And I went to this event, God, it was like now 10 years ago. And it was really after the 2012 Obama campaign where like big data and tools really became a fad, and these new analytics companies came out of that. And it's like, we don't need to do polling anymore. We can measure with analytics, and polling was going to tell us that Mitt Romney won, but the Obama team's analytics said that they were going to win. And I was at this briefing of strategists and different companies and interest groups in 2015, and the people at the analytics firm were just like, we created this great model of likelihood to respond to a Democratic ad, and they were going on about how they had to get more computing power on Amazon Cloud because the best algorithm wasn't something that worked on a local machine, and it's our cart or something. And I'm sitting there staring there, and it's like, okay, and it's like built off this ad and responsive to this ad. And they showed this 2-minute ad of like promoting the Democratic Party that was just horrible. Just like a completely ridiculous, like uninteresting, uninspired ad. And it's just like, how are we going to build any, like, what is the data that we're getting out of this? Like, you're going to tell people to, like, okay, go to these people because they responded to this ad, but like they're testing really bad, terrible content. And I was sitting there like thinking I was going crazy. And like everyone in the room was just sort of, I assume there were some people like me who were just like, what is this? But that became the dominant culture within the Hillary Clinton campaign of like, we don't need polling anymore. And it crystallized to me in 2016, like I had a very hard time as we got to the end of the election to find calling house time to actually do the polls that people wanted me to do. And I have a long story that we'll not share here of like using this one phone bank, and then I ended up flying to Colorado and couldn't actually like find where they were actually working because it was like clearly. So I had to redo all these interviews, and this person like normally was like, okay, we got a whole bunch of calling time. We can do like 3 or 4 of your polls that you want to do. I was like, great. It's like, thank you so much. It's like, well, don't thank me. Thank our next president of the United States, Hillary Clinton. And I'm just like, okay, I'm happy I have this calling time. I can actually do this, but why are they not doing polling right now? And then fortunately, like my candidates won, and we flipped the New Mexico House, and we know what happened in the presidential race and a lot of the others. Yeah. But that was sort of the balance that got off. And I was going back and looking at where the polling and analytics problem really began was if you go back and look at the 2015 governor's race in Kentucky, the Democrat Jack Conway was leading in polling the whole way. And apparently the Democratic Governors Association was telling independent expenditures that their quote unquote research and their analytics were showing don't do any get out the vote campaign on the independent side. We want super, super low turnout. And they got low turnout, and the Republican won by 9 points. And it was just like, you always need to be constantly challenging your own thoughts. And part of like what science is trying to control what's the impact of one variable and control for how that one variable is. When political campaigns, as we all know, are multivariate, lots of things going on that science can't optimize for. So it's like there was a lot of signs, particularly before Trump, that maybe this data-driven approach is not going to be the salvation of the Democratic Party. And I think there's lots of cases where analytics has helped, being able to target split-ticket voters. Democrats did win 3 Senate seats in states that were won by Donald Trump in 2024. So it is sort of very good at the margins, and then bringing scientific rigor to what you're doing is always good, and bringing more data, but it's not the be-all, end-all. There definitely was a culture, particularly after the 2012 campaign, where like data was it, and analytics is it, and polling is not. But it's finding that right balance. It's just there's no one method that's going to be foolproof and this is the answer and we've solved this problem for good. That's just never going to happen.
The big irony for me from sort of this whole big data discussion is that big data emerged as the fad, as you rightly pointed out of the Obama campaign. This is a politician who had these natural gifts of authentic connection with voters. And it seems that the lesson that was learned was, wow, look at all these fancy analytical tools that we can use on the margins, as you say, rather than, well, I'd say we didn't, I think there's a lot of admiration for President Obama's political skills, but to me, this is like a great irony, right? That particular moment, the sort of fad that emerged was big data and analytics and not connection. But so I wonder, do you think is that a right diagnosis of what lessons were learned, and are there different factions within the Democratic Party that maybe are rejecting those lessons or have taken a different approach to how they try to develop connections with their voters?
I think what you said is definitely true. It is sort of amazing to me that it's like the lesson from the Obama campaign is like tactics as opposed to candidate. I think the other problem that we have sometimes is equating campaigning with governing, and that you can solve problems in governing in the course of a campaign. I think that was one of the lessons from 2012 was like the economy was horrible because of the financial crash between 2009 and 2012, and Obama still got reelected anyway. And I think by the time we got through the second term, it's just like there wasn't enough actually delivered and accomplished in the government that could be solved in, like, there's no amount of campaign tactics that would have solved that problem. Just like there was no campaign tactics that were going to help Pierre Trudeau get reelected last year. Justin Trudeau. Sorry.
I was like, are we talking about Pierre Poilievre or?
I'm like, history podcast.
There's no amount of campaign tactics or methods that was going to help Justin Trudeau get reelected, or the Liberal Party get reelected nationally. Need a different campaign with a different dynamic, and that changed instantly. But that wasn't a result of the campaign. That was a result of the world changing in a way, and Mark Carney being able to fit that much better than Pierre Poilievre did. And I mean, as followed this through Kyla, just like how poorly Pierre Poilievre ran his campaign too, because he couldn't adapt.
I didn't say that. Fact check. What are you talking about?
That's what I interpreted from what you said. You can edit that out. But it's I think that's part of it. But it's just like it all comes together. It's governing, it's campaigning, it's candidate, and tactics or technology is not going to solve problems that are made in governing. Problems like not going to sell nationally a candidate who doesn't have the ability to connect on that level. My hope is that we're sort of rebalancing between like analytics and data is everything, and trying to understand more leadership and basic communications and cognitive ability. That's my hope going forward, and that we can use different tools to be able to measure different things. But that's part of all the things that we need to do to change in a dynamic environment.
And the Democratic candidates that seem to be kind of catching on in this kind of attention economy, and there's sort of attention getters, typically seem to be coming from the left of the Democratic Party, or the progressive wing, maybe even Democratic Socialist wing of the Democratic Party. I have this sort of model in my head of kind of like leadership affiliated Dems and the sort of the left side of the Democratic Party. Are these two groups taking different approaches to how they use data? And like, if you probably have a much better inside look than we do into some of those methodological differences or differences in approach, how would you characterize the differences between these sort of loose factions of the Democratic Party?
That's a very good question. I think it's too early to tell yet. I think yes, there are some candidates like Zohran Mamdani and AOC that I think sort of breaking through in terms of different types of leadership and critiques. I would say also in the last year, I would say Gavin Newsom, JB Pritzker have broken through just in the way that they have conceived of. They've actually done something to directly challenge Trump and show leadership. Like Gavin Newsom used the opportunity of the Texas redistricting to basically like change California's laws, pass a constitutional amendment, redraw the districts to try to balance the U.S. House and challenge Trump directly. J.B. Pritzker forced ICE out of Chicago and have sort of a very clear, like, we're providing leadership and we're using our power to protect our citizens. I think it's too early to say what type of model of leadership will work. And like the Democratic Party, it's candidates, there's consultants, there's voters, there's also donors. And so when you're thinking about 2028, it's like, who are the candidates that are going to be able to like have something new to say, have a theory of power and change that they can back up with examples from their own career, and who are going to be able to raise the $500 million, $1 billion that they're going to need to be able to compete through 2027 to 2028. I think there'll definitely be a candidate on the left who will, whether it's AOC, whether it's Bernie Sanders tries at 90 to run for president again, who knows? They will have the money to be able to compete. Gavin Newsom definitely will. J.B. Pritzker can finance his own campaign directly. And I think that's right. Sort of like the models of leadership, the people that can compete on money, the people that can sound new and fresh, and then ones who have a theory of power and can provide examples of how they've used that power to the benefit of their own citizens or to be able to like fight the Republicans. And like Gavin Newsom is going to be able to say, it's just like, I'll be able to change and bring reform to Washington and try to reform the Supreme Court and the filibuster and all the things that need to happen, because it can show these examples of me being able to do that in California. And whether that resonates or not, we'll sort of see what world we're living in at that point, how all the other, 2 more years of the Donald Trump presidency is going to bring this, how horrible it's going to get, and who's going to have the strongest response to it.
I'm not sure if you saw, this was, I think in January, Jasmine Crockett was on The View talking about how Democrats are too reliant on polls, whereas Republicans are experts in focus groups and trying to find like the emotional triggers that shape opinion. Are we going to see these kind of disruptive, I don't know if that's the right word, a disruptive candidate, I don't know, this new generation? Are they going to lead the charge on the classic qual versus quant debate? Are we going to see a resurgence in the focus group?
I think the holy grail is to be able to like, how do we bring qual to scale? Which I think we will. Yeah. I will say, not to be snide, but Jasmine Crockett did go on to 2 months later to lose the Senate primary. So
yeah, she might have maybe been able to use that like 1 minute on The View slightly differently. Maybe not a methodological debate, but I loved it. I was like, when was the last time that focus groups were brought up on The View?
Exactly. I do hope that we can find more ways to extract qualitative information on one-on-one conversations. Like I'm as you know, like you, big fan of being able to talk to voters directly and not have sort of the crosstalk between other respondents or people trying to pose for other respondents. So I think the more ways we can have one-on-one conversations, be it on a Zoom call or text message or even conversations with other people, be able to have many more of them and extract the insights from those to write better messages and sound more like human beings will definitely be progress. And that's like kind of what I think Jasmine Crockett was getting at. It's just like trying to use things to sound more real.
Yeah.
Rather than here's a talking point that gets a 78% percentile score or whatever we have in some memo that someone has written that a Silicon Valley funder is paid for. It's just like I think the approach that relies on human beings is still going to be more important than like impossible to decipher scores and weird memos.
On that note, let's talk about robots. The term big data honestly, it feels almost passe. Like everything has moved in the discourse to a conversation about AI. Obviously, these are not necessarily two different things. But I think like every industry, there's going to be a lot of opportunity, a lot of threat created by AI. I'm going to ask you to be an optimist for a second. Are there any use cases that you feel hopeful about or excited about when it comes to the use of AI in political campaigns?
Oh yeah, I think data mining language is, I think, the key part of this. I was working, one of the campaigns I'm working on, I asked like the people who support my candidate and the other candidate, like why they support them and what doubts they have about them. And it came back of just like, well, this one candidate's running mostly on being supported because of her identity and who she is. And then the other candidate is just like based on his plans and his experience, which sort of got at the dynamic that actually exists in that race. That is what I hope. I think that will help bring qual to scale in a way that will have better and deeper insights and they'll be able to do much deeper listening than what past techniques have been able to provide. I think trying to show ads or messages to robots or synthetic data, like I have like doubts about. I just heard a story yesterday about a congressional primary where someone did an AI poll that had her in second place and she finished in seventh place with 2.5% of the vote. In the studies I've shown of AI trying to predict opinion versus what true opinion is have been, I mean, horrifyingly bad.
Yeah.
So like that, I think trying to get robots to act like humans and give us human insights is not really where, which thank God is probably not where things are. And training like people based on past data and not giving them new information is going to also lead to not great outcomes. But I think the tools for us to be able to process and gain more insight from all the data that we do collect I think that's the most enormous untapped potential. And to be able to turn that into scripts that are emotionally relevant for ads or help produce lots of different content that people are going to respond to. I think that's, if done well, will be effective. You can also see the opposite case where it produces a bunch of divisive content and our campaigns become even nastier, more vacuous. But I prefer to be on the optimistic side of it, at least for this point.
I actually just got my first sales pitch just the other day on the use of synthetic data. And I was like, well, was it trained on Canadians? And they were like, No, mostly, our American respondents. And I'm like, well, I do political polling. So I'll maybe wait a couple years and maybe we'll circle back. But I don't think at this juncture. But this has been so much fun. I always love being able to, talk about the Democratic Party with you. As always, our final question is, what's one source of data or vibes on our political culture that you follow, read, that you think our listeners should pay attention to as well?
I'm going to sound like some of your past guests. The Pew Research Center, I think, still produces the best content and cares truly. My boss 25 years ago was just like, Pew is one of the things that I truly trust because they care about getting it right, which so many other people do not do. I'm a Washington Post print subscriber, so I'm trying to deal with navigating where I'm going to get news now that my sort of main news source that would come into the house is getting much, much progressively worse. And I refuse to support the New York Times for reasons that would be a whole
That's
other
the third
podcast.
item on the list.
But I think right now it's trying to find actual news sources of people that I've read before, who write interesting things on Substack. Juliet Morris, now that he's sort of free from the shackles of ABC and 538, writes really insightful commentary on polling and public opinion that's not sort of filtered through legacy media. And I always make the sort of, I should read more foreign sources and get a perspective from America from abroad. But other than occasionally looking at The Guardian, I don't really do that. But that's sort of my goal. But I'm sort of in this sort of news, trying to navigate this new world like everyone else.
Well, that's okay, because that fits our Canadian stereotype of Americans paying attention to the rest of the world. So we can leave on that note.
Great. Thank you so much, Steven. This was great.
Thanks so much to both of you. This was really fun.
All right. It's time for Random Sample. Gabe, what have you got?
All right, Kyla. I'm a little passionate about this one. Riddle me this. What do you call a policy with no ideological polarization, broad scientific consensus against it, and near universal public support for abolishing it, and that most governments have been too cowardly to kill for decades? The policy is switching our clocks for daylight savings time.
Okay.
I will give a credit to BC, who announced very recently that clocks will never again fall back. BC made the obviously correct decision to favor daylight into the evening. Well, Angus Reid had a poll out this week showing that the majority of Canadians share my correct opinion. I am, as ever, a man of the people. 86% of Canadians want an end to clock switching. Now, to be fair, the story is a little more complicated than just that 86% top line, because within that 86%, 53% want permanent daylight savings time. Kudos to them. Brighter evenings. And 33% want permanent morning person time or standard time. There is one outlier, only one in Angus Reid's poll, and that is Saskatchewan, where a majority of 54% favor permanent standard time, the brighter mornings and darker evenings crowd, and 41% want it the other way around. Kyla, your people have a lot to answer for, in my opinion.
You don't understand. We can get to this after you get to the end. You don't understand how dark a Saskatchewan morning is. It makes sense. Also, we are converted on this. We have permanent, blah, blah, blah. Continue.
Permanent standard time, yes, okay. Well,
apparently I'm passionate about this too. Who knew?
Yeah, well, the most correct province, in my opinion, is Newfoundland, where a 2/3 majority want permanently brighter evenings. YouGov poll from earlier this month in the U.S., when you take out those people who aren't sure, has 80% in favor of stopping the semi-annual clock changes and a majority in favor of brighter evenings, even among people who say They wake up early. So is it time for governments to act? Obviously, and they should act to implement my preferred option. We asked our pollster panel last week if there was like an 80-20 public opinion issue that governments haven't acted on, and stopping the madness of changing our clocks is, in fact, an 86-14 issue here in Canada. The problem will be picking a lane after making the switch. There's a lot less consensus there, and we have kind of a collective action problem. Who's going to be the first mover? But we do have a first mover. It's BC. First mover because permanent brighter evenings. Saskatchewan, permanent brighter mornings. Not as big a fan of that. But it's time for others to join this movement and make our long, cold winters a little less grim.
Great. I love the passion. This is what made, not that you're not always alive, but it really made you come alive. So yes. I appreciate it.
Passionality and rationality. That's
perfect. Perfect.
All right, Kyla, what have you got?
I'm actually going to cite some research from my polling firm, Relay Strategies. It only took 5 episodes of this podcast for me to just cite myself. So I think I get like a gold star for that. But one of my sort of current areas of interest or obsession is the entire just healthcare wellness ecosystem. Post-COVID, we've obviously seen, such a proliferation of healthcare misinformation and the sowing of distrust when it comes to our healthcare institutions, in science, kind of in general. And, collecting public opinion data about misinformation is kind of a tricky thing to do because you can ask people if they're concerned about misinformation. Of course, lots of people are. But to ask people if they've actually been targeted by misinformation is kind of hard because it wouldn't work if we were aware that it was that you had been misinformed, right? Right. No one wants to think, I found this really compelling. I have been duped. So I think what can be a kind of more helpful way into approaching the issue is to look at, just their beliefs. What things do they kind of agree with and what do they not? So I'd asked Canadians how concerned they are about a variety of healthcare issues. And at the top of the list is a pretty conventional concern, lack of access to a family doctor. But also in this top tier, you find things that are kind of the darlings of the online wellness space. So looking at things like food and products impacting our hormones, doctors not trying to find the root cause of illness. I'm not saying that necessarily that this is misinformation, but it is sort of these component parts of distrust, right? Of really doubting the system. And we see a huge generational gap, which I think explains a lot, or it can be explained a lot by where people are getting their information. Obviously, young people are a lot more likely to be getting their information from social media, which we know, that where the wellness space is very alive and well. For example, 38% of those under 35 are very concerned about doctors not trying to find the root causes of illnesses. This declines to 26% among seniors. 32% of those 18 to 35 are very concerned about food products impacting our hormones. 24% of seniors say the same. And one of the areas that I see on social media the most that I find just as a woman, as a feminist, to be deeply disturbing is the fear-mongering about birth control, especially given what has happened to reproductive care in the US. If we look at young women, 55% of young women, so under 35, are concerned about women being on birth control. And almost 1 in 4, 22%, are very concerned about this, but only 7% of women in their 50s and older are very concerned about this. And I think that is such a jarring, I think, reflection of the data. And this is always comes as a surprise to men, but when I describe this, it's like, you don't have to be a woman on the internet for very long before you start seeing information about your hormones and you start seeing information, talking about a lot of things that have been, debunked about the risks and impacts of birth control. So this is you're advocating so passionately for daylight savings time, permanent daylight savings time. I'm advocating to, the feminist organizations. The pill needs a champion. Someone needs to take this on. There is so much misinformation out there, or so much distrust around women's health, and a lot of that for good reasons. But if there's some great, compelling gynecologist that wants to create a TikTok account and start taking on this information, you should. Anyways, if I get my shit together this week, you can read about this in my Substack. If I don't get my shit together, you can read about it early next week. But the data will be there, and it's pretty interesting stuff.
I'm looking forward to it. Well, everyone, that's our show for this week. A big thanks to Steven for joining us in the lab. We also want to send our thanks to future sponsors for helping to keep our show available to you for free, to you, our lab rats.
Gabe, where can the people find you?
I am at Gabe Roche on all the platforms. And you, Kyla?
Yeah, and you can find me at Ronellenfitsch on all of the social mediums, and Relay with Kyla Ronellenfitsch on Substack. We will see you all again next week.
Bye.
Welcome to the Culture Lab.